Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income. I'm Alex Howlett. This week's topic is Baumol's cost disease. So William Baumol was an economist, a pretty prominent economist who died a couple years ago. And he had this idea. Oh, I'm listening to myself. Hold on a second. Sorry about that. You guys probably didn't see any of that, but I was listening to myself talk for a little while. So yeah, so William Baumol had this idea, which is now called Baumol's cost disease. And the idea is basically that as worker productivity increases in some sectors of the economy, those workers command a higher wage. And then because workers in general in the economy are commanding a higher wage, that means sectors that are lower productivity or more labor intensive, those workers, in order to attract workers to those sectors, you have to compete with the higher wages in the higher productivity sectors. So then the consequence of that is that prices in the higher productivity sector get cheaper as they get more productive, they can produce more with less labor, that kind of thing. But then prices in the more labor intensive sectors get more expensive. So the examples that often that kind of the canonical Baumol's cost disease example is the idea of a string quartet 200 years ago, doing exactly the same amount of labor to play the same song as a string quartet today. But in order to get people to play in that string quartet, you have to pay them a wage that's consistent with like the level of wages in today's modern economy. So I chose this topic partly because it's come up a bunch of times in our discussions in the past. We've talked about the labor market, we've talked about inflation and various things about prices. And actually Alex Lancaster often brings up, well, how is this related to Baumol's cost disease? That kind of thing. And I think, in our discussions, we've come up with alternate explanations for many of the things that Baumol's cost disease claims to explain in our economy. So in terms of how it relates to basic income, we have basic income as a mechanism for getting money to consumers as an alternative to using wages as a mechanism to get income to consumers. So then we can ask the question, how much does prices come from people's demand and how much money they have to spend, or how much does it come from kind of the costs of paying wages? If you have a basic income, can you pay lower wages? Does that allow higher efficiency workers to be paid less and not drive up wages, that kind of thing? When we talk about basic income, we talk about as the economy gets more productive, maybe wages go down rather than up, that kind of stuff. So let's go around. I guess I talked for maybe a little bit too long there, but let's go around and get people's initial thoughts on Baumol's cost disease, if you have any thoughts about it and how it relates to how you think about basic income. So we will go in the order Martin, Derek, Elizabeth, David, Elliot, Joan, Steve. So go ahead, Martin.
So one of my first thoughts is consistent with what I've expressed in the past about how complicated some of these things are. That if you use the example of the string quartet, you don't need as many string quartets these days for everyone to hear strings music, because first they'd buy the album, maybe the record album, and then they'd buy the CD. Well, anyway, you get the idea. So even technology is sort of applying there. And my other thought was, and maybe it's one of the quotes you'll pull out of the article, but the article talked about this same kind of productivity increases in services, in labor, as if maybe it would happen and then blah, 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 something would change. And my sense is that it's absolutely happening. And again, I'm coming at it from a little bit of a fourth industrial, and clearly one can see the possibility of this, of some of the same phenomena happening in labor intensive as we see in other productivity increases via technology.
Yeah, Derek, go ahead.
I don't have a lot of thoughts to start with. I'm interested in hearing what you guys think about it. But I took some notes reading the article. It seems like there's a lot of us. This relies heavily on the assumption that wages is how people get their income. And there's right in the beginning of the article, it mentioned how a couple things that struck me were just that the assumptions are that wages are paid out according to productivity. And I kind of wonder how true that is, because these days, at least, we take it for granted that there's a large stagnation in wages relative to productivity. And I wonder if that kind of information wasn't available or hadn't started yet when he was coming up with this theory, or how people that find this theory powerful, like how they react to that observation.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Elizabeth, go ahead.
I think I don't have a lot in the way of sort of initial thoughts on the article. Reading it, I was like, okay, yeah, a lot of this feels like a sort of intuitive argument for what it's arguing for. But even just here, but I was like, okay, I assume that this is more complicated, and so the stuff that people have said so far feels compelling as complications to that, but I don't sort of have my own initial thoughts on it.
Okay, sounds good. David, go ahead. If you're there.
I haven't really thought deeply about this, so I'm just gonna hang back and listen.
All right, perfect. Elliot, you're up.
It's a very interesting topic, and I would like to have more thoughts on you guys on how it works. But the idea of having the product produce and then dropping down as we produce more, and the flux in that is interesting. I would like to know more about. I would like to read the article and take notes and figure it out. It's an interesting topic, though. Thank you.
Great. Mom.
I have mostly questions. One of the questions has to do with the idea of the musicians and labor intensive, that definition of labor intensive versus productivity. Because when you gave your intro speech, you talked about the high productivity being labor intensive. So I'm a little I know, but it's not, it's low productivity. So I'm a little confused about the relationship between productivity and labor intensive, those two things. And then the other thing that I'm curious about is, why is it called a disease, cost disease? That's a pretty heavy, a term to use, and negative. And I'm not sure from reading it, as much as I read anyway, why it's why he has to label it that. So those are the two things that I'm hoping to learn more about, how the idea of labor intensive relates to low productivity, because it's no, high productivity that drives up the prices, the wages.
Yeah.
But that's not the same as something being labor intensive, which it's not intuitive to me that those two things are different.
Right. So first of all, I just want to comment on the cost disease
Right.
nomenclature. There are some people who object to it, and they say it shouldn't be characterized that way. They want to call it the Baumol effect or something like that. The reason why it's called the cost disease is just the intuition that stuff that wages that are higher kind of spill over into people aren't actually being more productive than they were before in lower productivity sectors. So the higher wages kind of spill over to them, and it's kind of like this contagion or something like that.
Oh.
I think that's where the term disease comes
Okay.
from. And then productivity, if you think about what productivity is, it's producing more with less labor. So the more labor intensive your industry is, the less productive it is, because the more workers it has to use for the output that it produces.
Yeah, I guess that's a little hard to fathom, because I think of people working harder, producing more, and that's more labor. So
right.
Yeah.
So depending on what your job is or what work you're doing, it could be more productive or less productive for the same
Right.
amount of effort. Yeah.
Right.
So that's the productivity thing. So let's go to Steve.
Yeah, as the wages of classical musicians went up, people stopped paying them. And that industry moved to cheaper ways of making the music and of transmitting the music. So that's sort of regular economics. I think the disease happens in the case of, say, teachers and nurses, where the labor-intensive industry wages go up, but people or the government just keep paying anyway. And then there's no incentive to automate. There's the price goes up, people keep paying, and everybody wonders how that happened.
Yeah, so that's interesting. So there's the question of, is this job naturally more labor intensive, or are we just assuming that the same amount of work needs to be done and paying for it rather than looking for ways to make it more productive, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think there was a lot of pressure to automate and make cheaper classical music out of necessity, out of survival of that industry. But that hasn't happened with teachers and nurses and universities and so on.
Yeah. So Bethany, initial thoughts on Baumol's cost disease as it potentially relates to basic income even?
I missed the intro, so I'm still excited to like remember exactly what it is. But I always like these topics. And yeah, I think it's interesting to think about how well, I guess we'll get into this, but like how your productivity affects your wages, if at all, too, in addition to the question of like whether you have wages from basic income. But obviously one of the things that affects what someone's willing to pay you is how much money you make them. But another thing that is, is how many other people want the job, how many people are qualified for the job. So I'm interested in trying to think through like the relationship between your productivity and your wages.
Yeah, so my intuition is always that you pay the workers enough to get them to do the thing. That's kind of the baseline there. You could imagine a scenario in which a worker becomes, or in which a certain job becomes more productive, and that allows you to fire 9 out of 10 workers and then pay the remaining worker slightly more, or something like that. So he's being rewarded for his increased productivity or whatever. But the overall effect there is that the business is saving money and paying less for labor because they've gotten rid of the other workers. They've gotten more productive. And when you see like productivity increases in the economy across the whole economy, what you generally expect kind of keeping everything else equal is that you'd expect lower output and lower wages, because the first thing that happens is all the businesses start paying workers less or having fewer workers. So now consumers have less income, and then the output of the economy is constrained by how much spending power consumers have. So consumers have less spending power, so the economy produces less. So the higher productivity, when we get to higher productivity, you would expect less output if the mechanism by which people get their incomes is through jobs. And yeah, go ahead.
Well, I guess in terms of my first point, it does seem though like there would be a ceiling on what I'm willing to pay somebody that is affected by their productivity. Like, assuming, let's say, like everyone just does like perfect unionization and like really monopolizes the price of labor or whatever, and there's no competition between people for the job, there's still this ceiling that comes from like, how much is it really worth for me to have anybody make this product, which is affected by productivity, right?
Yeah, and there's this theory in kind of basic economics that workers are going to get paid based on their marginal productivity. So if you're a business, then you're going to keep hiring more workers as long as it's profitable for you to do so. And it's profitable for you to do so until you get to the point where hiring an additional worker costs you just as much as it benefits you, that kind of thing. I would argue that production stops before you get to that point, or you're not. There comes a point where you can't really hire additional workers. You never reach that point where workers are being paid based on their marginal contribution, that kind of thing. Yeah, Mom, go ahead.
Oh, well, I was thinking about what Steve said about musicians, because I'm still not clear on how that relates to productivity. And if I mean, obviously, we can have recordings and musicians can go into a technological route, but in general, artists are not going to be in the same basket of productivity, low productivity, or high productivity. It's a whole different. So I'm not sure why he used that example actually in the article.
Yeah, so this is actually the example that Baumol used, and it's kind of like why he got this insight. And I think he actually was a musician as well, so that's kind of what inspired him to think in that particular area. The basic idea is that the same number of people need to perform for the same amount of time to play the same piece as they did hundreds of years ago. So the amount of labor that goes into playing the piece has not changed. It's not getting kind of more productive, so to speak. You can't just have one guy sitting there playing a string quartet. Or if you have one guy, playing all 4 tracks, he has to take 4 times as much time because he's recording each track one by one or something like that. So that's the sense in which that's kind of like Baumol's argument why music is not getting more productive. I think Steve brought up some points which there's more to it than that. The way we do music now in our society is very different than it was 200 years ago. Back then, live performances were all you had. Now you have recordings.
Right.
So 4 people playing the same piece can now play that piece for billions of people because they can all listen to it on the stream or the recording or something like that. So in that sense, you've gotten a lot more productive. If you're measuring how many ears you get to perform for based on the amount of labor that's put in. So I don't think it's true that you have this kind of pure situation where music has not gotten more productive. It's gotten a lot more productive, and I would argue that part of the reason why it gets so expensive is not because it's gotten less productive, but because you have copyrights and you have this kind of superstar effect where you want to pay, the recording label wants to pay to have the very best person, even though he's only incrementally better than the next guy below him, and the next guy gets nothing or something like that.
Right.
So it's not that we're paying more for music in general. It's that we're paying more for live performances and we're paying more for the superstars. Right. So I don't think this analogy is a very good analogy for the kind of thing that Baumol is trying to demonstrate. Yeah, go ahead, David.
Sorry, I had to figure out my mute. I gotta agree with your that this analogy of music seems really off to me. I think first of all is the way you think about things has some truth to me, where you're trying to convince people that the labor market is simply a market to get people to do things they wouldn't otherwise do, and there's intrinsic value to making music. It's something that people do without being paid for, and that music itself, the music industry, the way we give people money for music is more about the marketing of the music than it is about the performance of music. I think that probably a lot of the best performers, the best musicians in the world, those people who you would consider to be the most productive musicians, are mostly unheard of, because what they're good at doing is making music. What the music industry is good at doing, or it used to be good at doing, is making money. And it's more like an advertisement, a branding type thing that they're doing than a performance thing. And I would also add that I think there are a lot of there have been a lot of advancements in making music more efficient. A person can, for the cost of a couple $1,000s, own all of the equipment you need to produce professional quality music in their own home. You can have all of the technology available to a 1960s professional rock star in your bedroom, for a couple $1,000s. And you can then distribute that without using any of the mechanisms of that the music industry used to have, which was all these middlemen and distributors and all these contacts with radio stations. You can just throw it up on the internet and distribute it to the whole world instantaneously. So I think that music is, and what has that done to the cost of music? What hasn't gotten musicians more money? They don't make money recording at all now. Essentially most musicians, 99% of musicians who are professional musicians don't really make money at all. The recording becomes just a way of promoting their live performances, which still seem like they demand the same kind of money in the labor market as they always have, which is not very much, but it's still something. You still, if you're going to have somebody who's a professional quality musician play at your wedding, you're likely going to have to pay them. So I think that what we've seen in the market is that when people become more productive through all this technology, their wages collapsed.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think there's a lot that can be said about the music industry and the ways in which it's gotten more expensive and paid more, and gotten less expensive and paid less, in which costs have gone both up and down, and things have kind of consolidated and concentrated and stuff like that. But as far as Baumol's cost disease goes in general, Derek brought up a point earlier, which is, the question of whether higher productivity really does command higher wages. And we can break the effect down into two parts. One part is that higher productivity leads to higher wages, and to what extent do we buy that? And then the next part is to what extent do higher wages in some sectors have this effect of spilling over into other sectors, causing higher wages there as well. So you can kind of break it into those two parts. Derek, go ahead.
Not to complicate it even more, but then the other question that this brings to mind is, what exactly are we measuring when we measure wages across a sector in aggregate? Because intuitively we all understand, and I think the musician is a great example, that there's such a wide range. A lot of musicians are starving artists and literally make nothing. And then there's a kind of professional class musicians who try to do a lot of, play for weddings for rich people, that sort of thing. And then you get the giant superstars who are making tons of money, and there's a whole range and somewhere in between. So if we're talking about wages increasing over time across a sector, we could be including different portions of those things growing, and there being actually just more musicians doing higher paid work. I'm not sure. That seems relevant to me to pick out the point that there's different sectors of wage earners within a sector, and I don't know. That to me would complicate the question of, like, do we want wages to be going up or down for a sector? Like, the answer is always, it depends.
Yeah, I think Baumol did a little bit of cherry picking here in kind of narrowing the scope of what he was talking about by saying, okay, it has to be a string quartet playing in a live performance. And then you've kind of like got the audience, numbers capped, and people have to go there in person. So you've got this very specific product that hasn't changed. And I would argue that, of course, there's a lot fewer of these live performances now that we have recordings. Recordings have competed with live music performances. Maybe not fewer in total, but fewer per capita, live music performances. But he's identified a very specific product and a very specific kind of form of labor that's used in producing that product. And the question is whether that very specific engineered example, or to what extent that example can be generalized and applied to other areas of the economy. And it's a little bit weird because there's fewer live musicians than before we could have recordings and that kind of thing. You guys ready for a quote from the article?
Can I just chime in one quick before we move on? In the sort of counterintuitive or a lot of different ways one could think about this. Some probably are familiar with this notion of the productivity paradox, which was sort of slowing productivity increases in the economy during, say, the 70s and 80s, when there was an influx of information technology. And So I'll just throw that out there. I mentioned my second career was in information technology, and it was not a bad, wasn't a bad gig, in terms of the compensation side. But some might say, here I am, I'm a decently compensated individual working in this technology, even as the technology that I'm helping to implement is seeing a lowering in productivity, or slowing, at least, in the rate of productivity increases. Shouldn't something have been different? Either I was having a more positive effect or I was getting paid less.
Yeah, so we did a whole one of these Boston Basic Income discussions on the productivity paradox a few months ago. So Baumol's cost disease claims to be able to explain this, just by the idea that people getting more productive leads, causes workers to move into less productive sectors, and then overall labor productivity doesn't grow as much as you would think it would, or something like that. I think, we kind of came up with a different explanation for why this happens. And it has more to do with the idea that we need to keep everyone employed in order to provide incomes to them. So we use various economic policies to create jobs for people, or to create an incentive for industries to create jobs for people. And those jobs are not necessarily productive, or as productive as they could be, partly because you're just making up work for people to do, and partly because the amount of production in the economy is still going to be constrained by how much money people spend. So if you're creating jobs and it doesn't provide them much income, you're not boosting economic output by very much. So that was kind of more of the story we told. So it was less about kind of this, people are being rewarded for being more productive, and then that spills over into less productive jobs. And it is true that people move to less productive jobs, but that's because we need to keep them employed. Like Baumol doesn't really talk about that as much. But yeah, it's this thing that's kind of puzzled a lot of economists. But when you think about kind of from a basic income perspective, okay, if we have a world with basic income, now if workers get more productive, that means we can pay them a higher basic income and they don't have to work as much. That means the economy is producing more and people are working less. So there's less labor going in for more output. That's higher productivity. So if you have in your mind this model of a world with basic income, it's a high productivity world where productivity is rapidly increasing. And then if you remove that and you've kind of got this indirect make work alternative world that we're actually living in, then you can see why productivity doesn't grow very fast, especially as jobs get eliminated and people we create less productive jobs for people and that kind of thing, especially during the times when technology is advancing more rapidly. Yeah, so anyone have any? Yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
Well, I missed the beginning, so I'm just curious if you'll re-summarize the Baumeister's thing in the readings, or if I should, not Baumeister, but yeah, if you'll re-summarize it in the readings, or if I could ask you to do it again.
Yeah, so quickly, all it is just the idea that workers in higher productivity sectors are going to command higher wages. And then in order for the more labor intensive sectors to compete with those wages, to get workers, they have to raise the wages in their sectors too. So the increase in wages in the higher productivity sector leads to a kind of a commensurate increase in wages in lower productivity sectors. And then the result, if you believe that the prices of goods and services are largely a function of how much you have to pay for labor, then you would expect that relative to that the higher productivity goods and services, their prices would go down relative to the lower productivity goods and services whose prices would go up. So because the costs go up, because the labor is the cost. So the cost disease is the wage.
Well, the cost is going up in both places, but you're like hiring fewer people or like you require fewer people in the high productivity. Is that why those costs go down? Like those.
And you're producing more per unit of labor.
I see.
So you might be paying the workers more, but they're producing proportionally even more than that. So the cost per unit of output is going down.
Gotcha.
Whereas in lower productivity sectors, the cost per unit of output is going up. So that's
Right.
kind of the explanation. And then we were calling into question whether higher productivity sectors actually or higher productivity actually commanded higher wages in the first place. And then we were also questioning to what extent that would spill over into the lower productivity jobs. I mean, you could imagine if you imagine a very simple economy where workers can kind of move between sectors and do different kinds of work, and you need this certain labor intensive thing, and workers do have the option of working in these higher paid, higher productivity jobs. In order to get them out of those jobs, you have to pay a competitive wage to kind of pull them out. But I don't really buy that, because it feels to me like if productivity is increasing, then for those types of jobs, for the higher productivity jobs, it becomes harder to get those jobs. Maybe the wages are increasing slightly or the salaries are increasing slightly, but there's fewer people doing that work because you need fewer people working for the same level of output. The story makes sense a little bit more if you assume that the higher productivity industries are just going to keep hiring people and producing more and more and more and more and more. But for most of the goods and services that we consume in our economy, there's a limit to how much of that stuff consumers actually want. There's kind of like a market saturation point, and especially so if consumers don't have enough income to buy all that stuff. So even if you had a basic income calibrated to the maximum level and everyone's able to buy everything they want to buy, there's still a limit to how much stuff they want to buy. Like most people, if you're not Jay Leno, are going to want to buy and own 32 cars, let alone 32,000 cars per person, right? If we get really productive with cars, right? There's a limit to that.
And you could add in whether there's like a limited pool of people who are qualified to do the two different kinds of jobs. And it seems like it depends on like how many fewer people you're hiring versus like the pool of people. Like if you're really competing, if you're really creating competitive pressure on the low productivity jobs, depends on how many fewer people you're hiring, basically, right?
I would generally think that if people are desperate for jobs because they need an income, that higher productivity is going to put more people out of work and make them more kind of desperate for jobs, and then drive wages down because you have more workers who are kind of competing for the jobs on the market. So you have to like lower the wage you're willing to accept in order to get them to create more positions or enough positions for everyone, that kind of thing. Go ahead, David.
I think my first thought is I need to see a lot more data on this discussion to see whether or not there's a correlation here. Just counting a couple of things, to looking at a couple of industries doesn't seem like it's enough to tell you whether or not there's some generalization rule there. But one of the data pieces I'd be looking for was the level of the amount of time that it takes to master that that craft. If you compared to the wage that it demands, if you're looking at a musician at a string quartet, and you're paying them by the hour that they're performing at the quartet, what you're really missing is the all of the hours that laborer went into preparing for that concert, which could be tens of thousands of hours learning that craft. And the same goes for any other skilled craftsmen or tradesmen or something like that, where the experience can't be duplicated. The experience it takes to do that craft proficiently is part of what pays for it. So I'm wondering whether or not, and although you don't see an increase in productivity, the automation or engineering hasn't found a way to replace that time, that investment in learning the craft.
And I think that's an interesting point because hundreds of years ago, there could be musicians in every town, right? And the amount of proficiency and practice you have to put in to get a paying gig would potentially be a lot less than it is today in a superstar economy. So for the superstars who are actually able to get paid to play in string quartets, the amount of effort and work that went into not just the performance part, but the before part is possibly, an order of magnitude greater or something like that.
Yeah, and I'm wondering whether or not the competition for that may not be there, because if one of these performers decides to not show up for the performance, it's not like the orchestra conductor can just pull somebody else off the street, offer them a similar wage, and have them step in and fill in that task. And the same might be said. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they typically have like understudies and backup people who are training and ready to go at any time, I think.
Okay. Great. Well, that's fair enough. But I wonder if what I'm suggesting is that in cases where we have big productive gains, what you might be seeing in those productive gains is that those jobs have people who are in the labor force that are difficult to replace. I can think of that like as an electrician, that these electricians have, why do electricians charge more than a carpenter? Well, the electrician may have a more rigorous apprenticeship program that they have to, and more credentials that they need to have that make it more difficult to replace an electrician than it would be to replace a carpenter. And the same might be said for other crafts that don't scale well in terms of labor.
Yeah, I think that's basically right. I think there is some truth to the fact that more labor-intensive tasks. Well, I guess it depends. Yeah, maybe more skilled is the better way to put it. If you've got a higher level of skill that's harder to replace, either because you're actually better at doing the thing, or maybe there are some barriers in the market put in place by your apprenticeship guild or union or something like that, that makes it harder for other workers to kind of break into the market to compete with you. It can either be a real skill thing, or it can be kind of one of these artificial things that we put in place. Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
Well, just to note, it can also be like, to incentivize the person to get the training, you have to pay a certain amount.
Yes.
Also.
Yep. Yeah. So there's labor intensive, and then there's kind of two dimensions that we're talking about here.
Mm-hmm.
There's more labor intensive, less labor intensive, and then there's higher skilled, lower skilled, right? And these two things are maybe orthogonal to each other.
Yeah, like for example, waiters in a restaurant. For now, we don't have robots. Like that's not necessarily as high skilled as something like an electrician, but it's still like labor intensive, I think, according to this definition.
Yes.
So I think
exactly. Yep. Okay. Anyone have any more thoughts before we get into the quotes? Okay, let's do the screen share here. Oh, there it is. Couldn't find it because it was a different color. Where are my windows? Oh, they've changed the interface. What? So I can share my whole screen, but I can't share an individual window anymore? Oh, portion of screen? No. What happens if I click screen? No. Sorry guys, they changed the interface on me. Select a window or an application. Oh, I want to select an application. Okay.
Babe, do you have it open on your computer or minimized? Because it has to be open.
I have it open. Let me close this and reopen it. All right, we're just going to share my screen and see how that goes. No, that's not what I want. I want to. Why? All right, we're going to share a portion of the screen. What's happening? Oh, moving this into place. Can you guys see that? That quote?
Yeah, it's like cut off on the
see it.
left.
Oh,
can
cut
see
off
it.
on the left. Yeah, let me All right, there we go. So in the 1960s, Baumol was trying to understand the economics of the arts, and he noticed something surprising. Musicians weren't getting any more productive. Playing a piece written for a string quartet took 4 musicians the same amount of time in 1965 as it did in 1865. Yet musicians in 1965 made a lot more money than musicians in 1865. The explanation wasn't too hard to figure out. Rising worker productivity in other sectors of the economy, like manufacturing, was pushing up wages. An arts institution that insisted on paying musicians 1860s wages in a 1960s economy would find their musicians were constantly quitting to take other jobs. So arts institutions, at least those that could afford it, had to raise their wages in order to attract and retain the best musicians. So I don't buy this story. I think, it says the explanation wasn't too hard to figure out. But I don't think, they were trying to attract musicians away from manufacturing sectors or something like that. I think there was, like in our society, when people want to be artists or musicians, oftentimes they're willing to starve in order to do that, right? So to some extent, cost of living increased, but this is all adjusted for, I guess it's adjusted for inflation, but not adjusted for what you could potentially, what the average, standard of living is or something like that. But I don't buy this as the story for this. I don't know. Does anyone else have any thoughts here?
I do. Actually, it's going to hit me. What if you flip this around and look at it from the supply side? If I was paying you in automobiles, let's say I was paying my musician in an automobile, and the musician, I want the musician to come in and work, and he can, he can work for me or he can work for the other guy. And well, the price of automobiles goes down, and so I can pay him an additional automobile every year, or my competitor will pay him an additional automobile every year, because it's become easier and more efficient to produce automobiles. I can pay him more because of that. Does that make sense? That because the economy becomes more productive, that cost of those cars goes down, I can then pay them more, right?
So the idea is that you're paying them more because you can afford to pay them more.
Because the whole economy has become more productive, I can afford to pay them more.
Well, I think generally speaking, economists like to think from the perspective of employers want to pay workers as little as possible. So the idea that you would pay them more just because you could maybe happens to some extent, but it kind of goes against kind of the profit motive and that kind of thing. It's more probably that you want to, I think there's truth to, you want to attract the best musicians, and I think it has more to do with the superstar effect of you want the best musicians than it has to do with competing with manufacturing or something like that. There's always a ton of people who want to be musicians who would be willing to give an arm and a leg to be able to play in front of a live audience in a prestigious, location or something like that. Yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
I just would like you to speak to the previous point a little bit more, because it seems like he's assuming that there's some competition for the best people, which we already see in music. Wouldn't it matter what they could afford to pay? Because that's, again, kind of like their ceiling.
Right. Yeah, no, that's a good point. So if you're the conservatory or whatever, competing for musicians, then maybe you're not super price sensitive. So if you can afford to pay more, you will pay more. And what matters is that you can get the musician from, compete with the other guy for the musician, that kind of thing. I think that is a good point. So I think David, yeah, that actually does make sense. Yep.
And I guess just a follow up is like, I'm still thinking that in extreme terms, this argument from the paper does make sense. I mean, even though it's not natural to think of competing for like automotive workers, if your salary were like so low that your quality of life would be terrible as a musician relative to an automotive worker, then even the most talented musicians might go into automotive work. theoretically.
I
So I
mean,
guess could you push back on it a little bit more? Because I wasn't totally
yeah,
persuaded.
I guess my intuition is that even in real life, we see a lot of the most talented musicians and artists starve themselves in order to be musicians and
Well, okay, but
artists.
maybe musician is not a good example of
Right,
his
that's my point.
but maybe there's a better example of his point that would seem more persuasive, because musicians, like, as people noted, is something that has a lot of other prestige and people like doing it. But maybe if it wasn't that kind of thing.
Yeah, so I like that you brought up waiters before.
Mhm.
I think those types of service industry jobs are maybe a better example. In terms of what drives up the wages of waiters, I don't know that it's that higher productivity, directly at least. I don't know that it's that you're competing with higher productivity potential jobs and you have to pull them away from that. I think it's more that the waiters, you've got rising, prices and costs in the economy, and the waiters, in order to survive, you have to pay them a certain amount, otherwise they just won't survive, and they'll either move out of your city or something, right? Like, you kind of have to pay them more. It doesn't feel like a Baumol's cost disease type
But
thing.
couldn't it be under some conditions? I guess I'm just thinking about.
So I think this is a real thing. I think, like, theoretically it makes sense that if you have workers that are indifferent between two different sectors or two different types of jobs, and one of those jobs is paying more, then in order for that other job to continue to exist, in order to be able to continue hiring people, you have to raise wages in the other job as well.
Okay.
Now, the question about whether it's due to higher productivity, that I think is a little more questionable, because, like I was saying before, the higher productivity jobs are maybe harder to get. So it's not like the jobs become more productive and suddenly everyone has an option to work in the more productive jobs. It's like now fewer people have the option to work in that job. So the idea that the higher wages and the higher productivity jobs are kind of like pulling workers away or competing for those workers doesn't quite add up to me. Does that make sense? Yeah, go ahead.
About the word productivity, I mean, my first inclination was to say, well, that word really doesn't apply to the musicians example, which is why I'm having trouble with it. We don't think in terms of artists as producing something more productive or less productive. It's more complicated than that, and so that's kind of what we addressed about different factors that go in, talent and training and the stars and all of that. But even in the example of a waiter, there are other factors involved in whether a waiter. How do you define productivity for a waiter? That word is troublesome to me. I'm having trouble following a lot of this because I'm not completely convinced about the word productivity. If you're doing widgets in a factory, yes, you can do many more widgets than somebody else. But when you get into more complicated labor, then that word becomes a problem for me.
Yeah, so the basic idea is just how much labor time goes into producing the result of the job, producing the output of the job. So if you're a waiter, you spend a certain amount of time waiting tables, and then how productive you are is like how many tables you can wait in that period of time.
Yeah, so then it is scaled back to a very simple numbers proposition, which doesn't really cover anything like the arts, for example.
Yeah, and I mean, this is, I think, partly why Baumol chose, a very specific thing, like, oh, how long does it take for people to play, a string quartet? And,
right,
the
but
output
even that's
is the
not
music.
specific enough, because those 4 people, some might be more talented than others. There might be a difference in training, and there might be a difference in,
Well, specific enough for what, I guess, is the question.
To use it as an example of how wages in one sector affect wages in the other sector. I guess that's what he's using it for that.
Yeah. So I think he's basically showing that the kind of productivity of the musicians stays the same over hundreds of years, or over 100 years or something like that. And then, if the productivity of other sectors is increasing, then you don't have to change anything about the musicians. It's still in relative terms, one is getting less productive relative to the other, and the other is getting more productive.
Yeah,
relative to the other.
I don't really buy it yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Bethany.
I think it might be helpful to think about it as a matter of degree, because like it's very hard, as Joan's saying, to like pin down that productivity has stayed like exactly the same. So maybe to think about it as like, are some industries growing in productivity at a different rate than others, and do they influence wages across? Maybe that's helpful.
And then there's also the idea that if you are not thinking about if you're not thinking about prices in terms of money, you're thinking about prices in terms of one good relative to another, then you can kind of frame all prices as being relative to each other. So the music performance gets more expensive relative to the widget. Like maybe a widget was really expensive in 1860, but now a widget is really cheap, and relatively speaking, the musical performance is more expensive now. Yeah. You still have your hand up, Mom, or are you done?
No, I'm done.
Okay, Steve, go ahead.
Sometimes I try to simplify productivity as just trying to think about how many customers per worker. So 100 years ago, there was, 5 tables per waiter. 100 years ago, and it's the same now. But for more modern businesses, like Facebook has like 1 worker for every 10,000 customers. And, Wikipedia only has 35 full-time employees. So they have like 1 worker for every, 50 million customers. So count those as productive and modern, whereas a restaurant waiter has not become any more productive in terms of workers per customer.
Yeah, I think that's a good, more concrete way of putting it. I like that. Yeah, we typically think about the output per unit of labor, but that's a little bit abstract, and I like the way you put it just then, Steve. Yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
Yeah, so I guess he's predicting that in terms of what I can buy for like quality of life, people in the less productive professions are getting wealthier in that sense over time. Is that what he's predicting? Or they're staying the same even though they shouldn't stay the same? And is that matching on to any kind of like empirical fact that he was actually trying to, that we actually see that he was trying to explain? Does that make sense?
I think he's less predicting how wealthy the workers are going to be, and he's more predicting the costs that go into the product that they're producing. So the cost of labor increases. So you'd see prices increase in more labor-intensive sectors, while they decrease in less labor-intensive sectors or higher productivity sectors.
And is that something that generally people have seen? Like, is that a real thing?
Yeah, I think that is generally true, that the products that can be produced more efficiently get cheaper, and then the stuff that is not benefiting from technological advances gets more expensive.
So like eating out is more expensive, isn't it cheaper than it used to be? I guess I'm trying to think about whether this is true in any kind of systematic way, but I don't know.
I don't think it's universally true.
Right.
I think that there is something that's true, which is that the average level of prices, especially in real terms, if you're just abstracting away from inflation or anything like that, the average level of prices is fixed. It's it's 1 or whatever like that. So if something gets less expensive, then by definition something else gets relatively more expensive. And if you're thinking in terms of money, if we're doing a good job kind of keeping the general price level stable, then you see kind of the same effect. As some things get a lot cheaper that are included in kind of the market basket of goods for the price index, you'd see other goods get more expensive. So the question is, what's making those goods cheaper? And a lot of times it's improved productivity, technological advancement, that kind of thing. So you see those goods get cheaper and other goods get more expensive. Notice that I explained the exact effect that Baumol's cost disease purports to explain without using Baumol's cost disease.
Yeah, but you don't have exactly. Yeah, it's tricky though. And I guess also Baumol would say that the prices are coming from wages, so he should be predicting that people in lower productivity professions are able to buy more stuff relative to people in high.
Yeah, I don't know if he speaks to that as much. He's thinking of labor as a cost, not as like a source of income for consumers.
But aren't they the same thing in his model? Like,
Yeah, they're assumed to be the same thing by most economists, but that's not the part that he's looking at, I don't think.
I guess I just think it's interesting because it's a prediction I think he's making that you could look and see if that's
I
happening.
don't think the prediction that he's making has anything to do with the flow of incomes going to consumers affecting their purchasing power in the economy. I don't think he's making any statement about that.
Because numbers are also changing, numbers of workers or something.
No, I think he's just looking at the economy. He's maybe even assuming Say's laws, like the economy will produce whatever it can produce and that kind of thing. And he's not thinking about inflation or anything like that. He's thinking about relative prices, and he's assuming that the economy will produce what it will produce, and then the more labor-intensive stuff gets more expensive, and the less labor-intensive stuff
But I
gets
mean,
cheaper.
if it's more expensive because people are paid more, then either those people are making more money or there's like more of them paid the same. But
Yes.
seems like a direct implication.
Yeah, he just doesn't really talk about that part of it, at least not for the Baumol's cost disease thing. It's more about the supply side than it is about the demand side.
Okay, but I just feel like if he's right, he should be making that prediction and we should see it in the world. That's all I'm saying.
If he's making the prediction that, yeah, I mean, I think we do see in the world that people's incomes go up over time. Wages go up over time.
But
yeah.
like relatively, the people with the lower productivity jobs, their wages should go up more, I think, according to his.
No, because I think
Oh,
he's
no,
imagining
no,
the higher
that's right.
productivity wages go up first, and they
I
pull
forgot.
up the lower productivity.
Sorry, I
wages.
forgot
Yeah.
about that. And then there's fewer of them, but they're like making more money.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Sorry, I got confused. I'm sorry to take up time on that.
That's okay. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Alex.
Anyone else have any thoughts before we get to the next quote? Okay, we're gonna do it, and we're gonna see if I can actually share the window this time. Nope, we're gonna share a portion of the screen. It's the same portion, so we're fine. You guys can see that, right? The consequence is that rising productivity in the manufacturing sector of the economy inevitably pushes up the cost of labor-intensive services like live musical performances. Rising productivity allows factories to cut prices and raise wages at the same time. When wages rise, music venues have no alternative but to raise ticket prices to cover higher costs. I think this is, like, you can understand kind of the logic here. I think there's a few things to notice. One is that when he says rising productivity allows factories to cut prices and raise wages at the same time, if you imagine that what the factory is doing with its higher productivity is simply increasing output, like keeping all the workers, increasing output. Now you can hire more workers and pay them more and that kind of thing. But if you're imagining that they're using fewer workers as a result of the higher productivity, then there's no reason, they're still going to cut prices and maybe they'll raise wages for the remaining workers to kind of keep them on, but there's no reason why that's necessarily the case. They could even lower wages now that they need fewer workers. There's more people competing for those jobs, that kind of thing. Like the 9 out of 10 people you got rid of are now bidding the wages lower or something like that. So there's that. And then the idea that when wages rise, music venues have no alternative but to raise ticket prices to cover higher costs. I think there's an issue here of price insensitivity for the people for the audience members, the people who want to buy these tickets. They're often willing to pay. There's a constraint on the number of seats in the auditorium, right? And as long as you fill up the auditorium or the theater, you're good. So you want to charge as high of a price as possible for that. I don't think it's necessarily like the labor costs or the costs of having to pay the performers that's driving up ticket prices in like Broadway and stuff like that, or in musical performances. Yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
Sorry, I had my hand up still by mistake from before.
Oh, you didn't.
I'll lower it down. Okay. Sorry about that.
Yeah,
I don't have my hand up, but okay, now I can put it up. There are other reasons why the costs could go up, though, for musical performances, other than paying musicians more. And it seems to me that you'd want to have something that's forcing those wages to go up for the musicians. That's not just because the other wages go up. I mean, I don't see the connection necessarily. It could
You'd
be
want
that
to
there's
have something?
what?
You'd want to have something forcing the wages up?
Yeah. In order
In
for
what
me
sense?
to buy into this theory, I feel like there needs to be a mechanism whereby I could see that the wages will necessarily go up. It's not convincing to me to make that statement without, why are they going up? I mean, what is it about the musicians' performances that now correspond with somebody making more widgets over here? It doesn't, I don't get it.
Yeah, because it's not like that musician is going to go make widgets if you don't pay
Right.
him enough.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I don't buy the Baumol's cost disease here. I don't buy the effect being the cause of either the higher wages for the musician or the higher ticket prices, right? Like you can have higher ticket prices without paying your musicians.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's, you want to charge as much as you can, and you want to pay your musicians as little as possible, only as much
Right.
as is necessary to get them to,
Right.
do the thing. So I could imagine that part of what would drive up the wages for the musicians would be more the superstar effect, that you want to get the best musicians and you want to pay whatever it takes. And
Yeah, but
you
how is that
can-
connected? Okay. How is that connected though to the raise in wages for the people making widgets?
It's not. That's what I'm saying. I don't
Oh.
buy into the Baumol's
Okay.
cost disease thing
Okay.
here. Maybe there's a small effect where, where there's really a lucrative job that someone could get that's like low skill or something like that, and it would pull the musician away from being a musician. But yeah, I don't.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't see it as a big thing. Yeah.
Mhm.
Anyone else have any comments? Okay. We'll go on to the.
I got a comment on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Elliot.
I was wondering about where does like gross domestic product fit into this piece or anything like that? Like people thinking, all right, I'm not going to pay that price and I'm going to walk away. I'm going to start a garage band or something like that. That funny piece of it that, like when we're set into some situation, we sometimes can drop off and say, that's it. How much can be like fixed amount that needs to be produced?
Yeah, I think what you're talking about is kind of the concept of a reservation wage. If no one's offering you to pay you, a certain minimum level, then at what point do you just say, all right, I'm going to just go do my own thing, that kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable point. If you don't pay the musician enough, they might just kind of, even if there's no job in some other sector that's going to pull them away, they might get pulled away by leisure. They'd rather spend their time doing something else instead of being a musician in your orchestra or something like that. My hunch is that for musicians in particular, what they really want to spend their time doing is being musicians in your orchestra. That's kind of how they got this far in the first place. So I don't think there's a big effect there for professional musicians, because a lot of times if you have some other job, and you're fed up with it and you don't think it pays you enough, what you do is you go home and, like you said, you start a garage band and you be a musician for free, that kind of thing, right? Like this is the kind of thing that people want to do on their own. They're kind of intrinsically motivated to do. Yeah. And as far as it relates to GDP, I don't think this, generally speaking, as we get more productive, if consumers have access to the spending money to activate that productive capacity, that increases GDP. And you kind of need a mechanism to get spending money into consumers' hands. And this is kind of what basic income gets for us. So if you're using basic income to ensure consumers can buy everything the economy is capable of producing, then that increases GDP. But on its own, if you increase labor productivity and people are getting their incomes from jobs, now, since the amount of economic output is being constrained by how much money people have to spend, you might actually see a reduction in GDP and economic output. You have to have the mechanism to put spending money into consumers' hands, and that's true. Even without basic income, we use other mechanisms to kind of get money to people, and some of that involves creating lower productivity jobs as an excuse to kind of funnel money to consumers. So maybe those jobs aren't producing more, but the role that they serve is to get people money. And I would argue that we would prefer basic income over doing things like that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Cool. Anyone else have any thoughts? Okay, we will go to the next quote. Uh-oh. There it is. It implies that in a world of rapid technological progress, we should expect the cost of manufactured goods, cars, smartphones, t-shirts, bananas, and so forth, to fall, while the cost of labor-intensive services, schooling, healthcare, childcare, haircuts, fitness coaching, legal services, and so forth, to rise. And this is exactly what the data shows. Yeah, I think the data does show that, but I don't think you need Baumol's cost disease in order to explain it. I think you can look at it more from just the demand, yeah. So the higher productivity stuff gets cheaper, which is kind of naturally what you'd expect. And then just relatively speaking, the lower productivity stuff gets more expensive. And that's going to always be true. And you don't need to tell any story about wages driving up costs or anything like that. Does that make sense?
Why do you think it's why do you think it's always going to be true? What's your theory?
Yeah, so I mean, like as your business gets more productive, you can produce the same amount of stuff at lower prices, and it's, you know, it can be profitable for you to do that. So as you do that and leave the other guys behind, then you see, you know, relative price movements. The stuff that's using the more productive technology gets cheaper, and the stuff that isn't gets more expensive. I think that's
Because
kind of pretty straightforward.
those sectors can't really use technology in the way that the ones that are making smartphones and bananas and t-shirts can use it. Healthcare can't do that. I mean, there is some
Yeah.
technological advances there, but they're not as severe, I guess.
Yeah, and I think there's other stories for why healthcare is so expensive, like price insensitivity by the consumers. Like your health insurance is going to pay whatever the price is; they have to, right? And then similar thing with education and that kind of stuff. And I guess it is true that you're kind of, for the more labor intensive stuff, you're paying more per kind of unit of output for labor. But I don't see this kind of spillover of like the higher productivity sectors are driving up wages, and then that kind of pulls up wages in the lower product. I don't see that part of the story.
Yeah.
Yeah. Derek, go ahead.
Just trying to wrap my head around it. I mean, funny sort of thing about when he shows this chart to illustrate the theory, I guess, is that it seems to be much more of an illustration of kind of what you were just saying, whereas that, well, yeah, we expect highly technologically productive industries, we expect costs to go down. Generally, the other kind of labor stays the same. The costs of those more labor intensive industries stay more or less the same. Maybe they rise a little bit, but then there's these radical upticks in medical care and education. And they're trying to show this as an example of how, well, this is why this caused disease. Look at these labor intensive costs going up. But it seems much more likely to me that those are like radical outliers, right? Something's wrong with the healthcare industry, something's wrong with the educational industry. And they're kind of the exception to the rule. So to me, this just says that there's a lot of other stuff going on that is not Baumol's cost disease.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. You know, I think if people are willing to pay whatever it takes to get the best, you know, education possible, and, you know, price is no object, then, and the colleges want the best students, then they will, you know, they will compete on dimensions other than price. They will, you know, hire more administrators to provide more student services. They'll build, you know, bigger athletic facilities and, you know, pools and libraries or whatever. You know, they'll do whatever they can to kind of attract those students, and they know that the students don't care about price. They'll pay whatever. I don't think this is a Baumol's cost disease story. Is your hand still up, Derek? You have another thought? Okay. Yeah, and I think so. I think the same thing is kind of true for healthcare, in that a lot of times the people paying the prices are not the ones receiving the services, and there's a little bit of kind of an incentive disconnect there to keep prices down. But in both cases, you might see a very high labor intensivity or very low productivity. But part of the reason you're seeing that is because the schools, they want to hire a lot more people to kind of like provide all the better stuff, because they know they can charge the higher prices, and that leads them to hire more people. It's not like these services are naturally as labor intensive as they need to be. They're more labor intensive because you wanted to hire more people to kind of provide the extra perks and stuff like that. Bethany, go ahead.
I wanted to follow up on that point, and ask you if there's a sense in which the other kinds of fields that are labor intensive, like waitressing, like haircuts, that aren't those specific outliers, are we also seeing the same trend where those things are getting more expensive relative to other goods and services? My sense is that with restaurants, vaguely, I have the sense it's not the case. I don't know how much of that is about wait staff, but I don't know, that could be an outlier in the other direction. So I guess it's hard for me to get a picture of like whether, as Derek says, it's just this is being driven by a few outliers of education and healthcare or not.
Yeah, I mean, my sense with wait staff and other kind of those types of service jobs and stuff like that is that we have, we feel like, society feels like these people aren't being paid enough, and we like raise minimum wage, and restaurant workers are always fighting to get paid more, and like, oh, we get paid below minimum wage without tips and that kind of thing. It feels to me like the forces that cause wages to increase in these types of jobs, it's not about competing with a higher productivity, higher paid job somewhere else. It's more about like this kind of social pressure and and kind of to push wages up. And it's actually not even that effective. Like those wages are not keeping up with even with inflation, let alone with what the economy could provide for people, which is increasing faster than inflation, right?
Right. And I guess people eat out much more than they used to. I don't know if that's because it's cheaper relative to other goods than it used to be or not, but that was kind of what I was thinking on the cost side.
Yeah, it's certainly cheaper relative to things like healthcare and education.
In terms of like general cars or something, yeah.
Yeah, in terms of general consumer goods, it's not clear to me that eating out has gotten relatively cheaper, but it is true that on average, people have more money to spend.
Right.
So that can allow you to eat out more, that kind of thing. And people are maybe busier, so they're willing to pay a premium for the convenience of eating out, that kind of thing. Yeah.
Both parents are working and things like
There's
that.
also, we didn't have fast food a century ago, so if you count that as eating out, then yeah. Mom, go ahead.
It still seems like apples to oranges in a way, because the things that are labor intensive, that they're not also as measurable as things like smartphones and cars and bananas and all the list of things that he has there. Healthcare, social services, education, those are all in another kind of realm of measurement in terms of what they're producing. So there's another disconnect for me between that theory and what might be happening. And I favor more what you're saying about them being outliers, but then outliers from what? They form their own kind of sector, these service industries, I guess you could call them. They're not actually producing goods, but they're responding to things, and so labor intensive in that sense.
Yeah, so the way economists think about it is that the service sector jobs produce services, and services are just another type of good. So the way you can kind of think about what a restaurant produces or what kind of wait staff produce is you can look 100 years ago and say like, okay, this is what a meal looks like. This is what the service of a meal looks like. And then you can look today and say, okay, this is what the service of a meal looks like. And it looks very similar. And then you can say, well, how much labor time are the workers the wait staff and the kitchen and everything putting in, and you can say, oh well, those things are roughly the same today as well. Maybe it's more efficient in fast food, or we have like some automated burger flipping machines or something like that. But generally speaking, a restaurant looks similar to how it did 100 years ago, and that's kind of how you can say that the productivity hasn't really changed. So I don't see a problem in that. It's just thinking about what the product is. Right, the product is
Right.
a service rather than a widget. But as long as you can define what that is, and it's concrete, and you can have a sense of what it looked like then and what it looks like now, you can kind of make these comparisons.
I
Does that
see.
make sense?
Yep.
Yeah. Derek, go ahead.
But I mean, I think maybe what's a possibility is that a service isn't just another kind of good, right? A possibility is that there's a kind of like a baseline expensiveness of labor that's different. And because if the business is producing a lot of goods to a lot of customers, technology allows you to just to chew away at that. You're using less and less labor. You're getting more and more goods. You're getting cheaper. But if something is just a service that's being provided, there's pressures to keep that a certain level higher, a kind of de facto minimum wage, even though it's not enforced. And that could stem from what Alex was talking about, society's desire to give people enough, right? That's very common, but also just the general cost of living. Even if someone's desperately poor, if you're offering a wage and it's not really enough to take care of the stuff that you're struggling to take care of anyway, you're not going to go waste time at the job. So that we could imagine that anything that's labor intensive, anything that involves people's work, that's going to rise a little bit over time naturally. And it's only in these other exceptional areas like we're talking about where we'd expect these big piling up costs of this expensive commodity.
Yeah, I think that's going to be true to some extent, as long as we live in a society that tries to provide people a certain minimum wage, to provide a certain minimum standard of living, that kind of thing. I like to imagine kind of an ideal world where the labor market is efficient and you can pay people as little as is necessary to get them to do whatever, and maybe a lot of people do things for free, and that kind of thing, and then maybe that kind of goes away a little bit. But I think, yeah, given the way we've structured things now, you're right that's kind of a limiting factor in the price of things that are labor intensive. Yeah. Steve, go ahead.
So barbers have not become more productive in the last 100 years, say. But the cost of a haircut has had to go up for the usual reasons, but I think that's sort of normal capitalism. It becomes a Baumol cost disease where no matter how fast the price of a haircut goes up, we keep paying it, and we can't figure out any way to avoid paying $300, $1,000 a month for a haircut. And then employers, it's so expensive, employers have to start including, haircuts in your salary, and the government has to make the employer haircut tax deductible and all of that. So it's, at the moment, haircuts is not a cost disease issue. It's just a regular market issue. But the others, healthcare, education, teachers, nurses, those are where it's become a disease, where we can't seem to get out of the trap.
Yeah, so I think it's certainly true that Baumol's cost disease assumes that these labor-intensive products, these goods and services, are going to still be demanded by the economy at the higher prices, because you can't pay people more if nobody's willing to buy the thing. So if nobody's willing to buy the haircut, so there's this assumption that people will still want haircuts even if they get more expensive, and the same is true of nurses and everything. I think you're right that barbers. I don't know if I would say that it's regular market effects that are causing the barbers' wages to go up. I mean, I think part of it is this minimum wage expectation. They're not paid minimum wage, but then there's also you have to, in a lot of places, you have to have a certification, that kind of thing. So there's kind of these barriers that create a little bit of a monopoly on the side of the barbers and that kind of stuff, so they can negotiate. They have negotiating power that's maybe beyond what they would normally get in the market. So I think that's true for a lot of workers, and maybe it's to the extreme with nurses and that kind of thing. So maybe to some extent it's a matter of degree. But yeah, I mean, I think you make a good point that Baumol's cost disease does assume that people are going to buy the product even at a higher price. Yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
Two things that are kind of small. One, barbers might be an example where we care a lot about quality, because there is quite a difference in skill, and we care quite a bit sometimes how it comes out. So that could increase price too, especially if that changes over time. But I just had a side question. Teachers, you keep bringing up teachers. Have teachers actually become kind of relatively more expensive? Like, I guess I wasn't aware of that, or I'm interested in why that's in that category.
Yeah, so I don't know if teachers have become relatively more expensive per se, but I think there are a lot of inefficiencies in the market for teachers. Teachers, one of those jobs where people really want to do it. They're willing to do it for cheaper, and there's a reason why teachers are often described as being paid very little and that kind of thing. So I think that's something that's true. It's one of these desirable jobs that people want to do, but they are able to keep up their wages, maybe beyond what the market on its own would provide them through like unionization and things like that. So maybe there are people out there who would be happy to be teachers, but they can't because they didn't break into the union or didn't do the certification. And then there are people who would love to be teachers, who would be really great at it, who don't want to do it because it pays so little. So there's kind of a lot of inefficiencies there when it comes to teachers.
I guess that's also a strange market too, because the price is set, if we're talking about public school teachers, by like governments and not by the consumer, which is the parents. And so I don't know quite how to think through all of that, but
yeah, that's a really good point too. And I think there's some of that with nurses as well. There's a disconnect between the customer and who's actually paying the price, and that kind of thing.
And maybe parents would pay teachers more, maybe they would pay them less, I don't know, but they don't get to decide kind of how to pay for quality when it comes to their school teachers directly.
Unless you're doing a private school, but then it's a whole other set.
Right, and I guess it would be interesting to compare the two. But anyway, sorry, I don't want to take us on too much of a tangent there. But
no, that's fine. Eddie, go ahead.
So one of the things I want to say is that I think that he should have called this thing Baumol's cost effect instead of Baumol's cost disease. Because, and I know Alex likes to think of the ideal UBI society a lot, but talking about the society that we're at, and even as we begin to move towards a more ideal, UBI society, a lot of people are, their entire earnings come from their labor, and a lot of them are, relatively unskilled, non-management workers, and their wages have not gone up for 45 years. And we actually want the wages to go up more, which means that we actually want the cost of labor to go up. Another thing that I thought while I was reading this article is that while it is true that services may be a little bit less susceptible to automation than manufacturing, it's definitely not 100%. There's different things that can be automated at every level. For instance, teaching, as an example, theoretically, with technology that we have today, with communication technology that we have today, you could have, if you set it up well enough, designed it well enough, you could have one teacher who could reach just millions of students, across the globe, potentially. So there's a lot of ways, and then you also have AI, which is making great leaps and bounds. But one of the things here is that one of the things that I notice and I like to point out is that a lot of people think that productivity growth raises wages, and I would say that it actually goes in the other direction, that when you have enough aggregate demand going on in the economy and enough labor demand as a result of that aggregate demand, such that your labor demand is, your labor wages are being competed up and up, that is actually what gives, incentivizes businesses to make the investments to raise productivity growth. So if the wages have not gone up for 45 years, then businesses do not have as much incentive to invest in the technology to raise that productivity. I think barbers, I think at an advanced enough level of technology, you could have an AI barber, but it would be really expensive and it would make absolutely no sense, right now. It might be, we might need another 40 years or something.
Yeah, I think those are all great points. And before you got here, actually, at the beginning, we were talking about, well, wait a minute, does jobs going higher productivity, does that actually pull up wages? And we're kind of questioning that. And I think that's a good question to be asking, because I agree with you that is, at the level of the whole economy, at least, that is not what you'd expect. You'd expect higher productivity means we're paying less for labor kind of as a whole, and that's a combination of people losing their jobs, and then it might even drag down wages in higher productivity sectors, because now you've got more people out of work who are bidding down wages for everyone else as well. Go ahead, Steve.
Concerning teachers, 100 years ago, there were 20 students per teacher, and now there's still about 20 students per teacher. And so that's why I assume that productivity has not increased, just by my own definition. Now, if, as Eddie suggested, online teaching actually worked, then that would be a use of automation to increase productivity in teaching, and would actually solve the cost of teachers. I would add that it would immediately create, as for musicians, online teaching would immediately create a star system. But the star system, I think, in both music and teaching is beside the point. That's just a coincidence, or at least a positive after effect of that the high cost of the teachers, that problem was solved, and it all moved, in this case, to online teaching.
Yeah, I think that's right. Stuff like MOOCs and online teaching and that kind of thing, it creates more of a superstar system for teachers. And then you would expect that a lot of teachers would be driven out of jobs, and then maybe kind of on the edges, there'd be still teacher openings, but there'd be a lot more people competing for that, bidding down the prices, except for the superstars who are paid, really, really high amounts, because all the online platforms want the best teachers, that kind of thing. It's the same as with what we see in the music industry. Bethany, go ahead.
Yeah, this is not so important, but I think for smaller kids, like up to maybe middle school, or at least up to 6th grade or so, like it's hard to scale it up, because a lot of it's childcare. So even if you tried to separate it, you'd still need like a whole bunch of childcare workers. And also, the younger you get, the less effective learning from a non-present human being is, because it's so much about like orienting attention and engaging in person. And so anyway, this is not so important, but I think higher education is different from like lower education in terms of how productive it can become per laborer, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. David, you had your hand up. Are you still interested in commenting?
Bethany addressed what I was going to chime in and say basically the same thing. Yeah.
All right, cool. So let's go to the next quote.
So can I interject one thing?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Martin.
So, in the sort of the spirit of it's all more complicated than so I'm looking at the chart, college tuition and fees, and I'll think of, so in my son's case, and the point here is US versus Germany. So in other words, there's sort of a horizontal element here that as you're looking at this effect, or call it whatever you like, does it apply everywhere? Does it, and the article talks about, well, why prices, certain costs are more expensive in, say, San Francisco than elsewhere. But as I look at the college business, my son's college education in Germany was probably relatively less expensive than it might have been in other places. And I say that with a degree of hesitation because it was actually a government benefit. His master's degree in the United Kingdom at a pretty well-known, kind of school, cost, relatively speaking, an awful lot of money. And but if you were to ask him, he would say that, well, the UK education wasn't really about the skills. It was about that he attended that particular university, and that's now, on his CV. And yet it was the education in the German university that got him into. And anyway, so what I'm just sort of trying to describe is that, any of these effects, is there some reason why we might look at it horizontally and say, is this more universal what we're seeing here, or is it more specific to different societies? And I say that just to sort of tie it back to UBI. In thinking about UBI, could conceivably some countries provide a UBI, this, you might say, the same effect of a UBI at a much lower cost? And if so, what lessons could we derive from that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think it's clear that there's different countries with different economies are seeing different cost effects. Like higher education is not seeing the same run up in costs in Europe as it is in America, and same thing with healthcare in different countries and that kind of thing. Yeah, David, go ahead.
I'm wondering, we're talking about this, how this affects education, which is interesting, and healthcare, which is interesting. I wonder what you guys think about how this would play out in the construction industry, and specifically like housing. I'm under the impression, and maybe is this sort of, I'm under the impression that sort of like housing costs sort of are huge driving. Housing costs and healthcare costs sort of eat the world, eat the whole economy. I'm wondering what you guys think about this, so whether or not wages play an important role in that or not.
I'm gonna say that they do not. My sense with the housing market is that it's being driven up by demand. Just that you have kind of these limited places for people to live, kind of concentrated in people need to live near where the jobs are in the cities and that kind of thing, and that kind of drives up the price of housing. And part of the reason that the wages of construction workers aren't really a factor here is that housing prices are going up regardless of whether the house was recently built or built 100 years ago or that kind of thing. Like it's something that's independent to what's being produced right now. Does that make sense?
It does to a degree. I get the inflation of the existing housing market, but I wonder if part of that goes to our inability to build new housing. It seems like constructing cost efficient, low cost housing we're just not able to do it. It doesn't make market sense to do pretty much anywhere. It doesn't make market sense near where the jobs are, and it doesn't make market sense in the flyover country where the jobs aren't. It's not getting built anywhere.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think that would change if no matter where people wanted to live, they were you knew they were going to have some income, and you knew they were going to be able to pay for, even a low income house or a cheap house or, a cheap apartment or something like that. If you knew there was going to be a ready supply of consumers, then those houses would get built. And if you have a basic income, then you have that. Is that what you were going to say, Derek?
Yeah, more or less. Just to point out generally too, I would add that I think there is a lot of cheap housing and land available, but people can't live there because, like you said, there's no jobs. And so I mean, I've looked at to punish myself because I live in New York City. I've looked at rental prices in other cities in the middle of nowhere, and it's like, yeah, well, I could live there for really cheap, but there's nothing. My work isn't there, right? So I can't move there. So I think people frequently look at this from production side. They say, housing is too expensive. We need to build cheaper housing, but they're not looking at the demand side of it, which I think is more relevant.
But I think that you guys will see that housing, those housing costs, if you're working in those locations, those housing costs will seem relatively high still. People are still paying a big proportion of their income to housing costs in those in the less expensive areas.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think, but part of the reason it's such a high proportion of their income is because they don't have enough income to buy the houses. So then if people don't really have that much income to make the building of the houses profitable, then they just don't get built. Yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
I'm just super curious, just as a short question, if the argument here, or David, I think it's David's point, if it's partly that it is very expensive to just build the house and that's creating like a pretty high floor on the price. Is that part of what you're saying? Because I don't know much about the cost of building a house.
Yeah, that's what I'm getting at. It's the cost of construction. It's not just the land cost. The cost of construction tends to be prohibitive for building.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that's true. It wouldn't be prohibitive if people had the money to pay it. And if if the house were valuable enough after it was built that it would justify the cost of paying those construction workers. But as it is, there are already standing, houses that are not able to be inhabited in a lot of areas where the jobs aren't enough to provide people enough income, that kind of thing. So why are you going to build more houses? You can't. It's just not profitable. Yeah. Okay, let's get to the next quote here. Where is it? And as Stephen Perelstein has argued, this has an important implication for government policy. Most of federal and state budgets are spent on services, law enforcement, education, healthcare, the courts, and so forth, that are subject to Baumol's cost disease. Government spending on these categories has grown inexorably in recent decades, and many conservatives see this as a sign that there's something badly wrong with how the government provides these services. But Baumol's work suggests another explanation. It was simply inevitable that these services would get more expensive over time, at least relative to private sector manufactured goods like televisions and cars. The rising cost of services is an unavoidable side effect of rising affluence generally. There is probably no way to maintain our current standard of living while cutting the costs of these services back to the levels of the 1950s. So I think this is for sure, the government pays for a lot of services, and for sure, services are more labor intensive. But I don't think that's the whole story here. I think there's a lot of inefficiency in government that has to do with incentive effects being distorted. I think, a lot of the points that conservatives make about government being inefficient, it's not just because the government is paying for services. Baumol's cost effect, and even then, the explanation for why more labor intensive things get more expensive, I probably wouldn't put too much stock in Baumol's cost effect as being the reason. Like the higher productivity wages are pulling up the lower productivity wages and that kind of thing. So to some extent, you would expect more labor-intensive stuff to get more expensive. I don't think Baumol's cost effect or cost disease is the main driving reason for that. And then I think there are also other government inefficiencies as well on top of that. Does anyone have any thoughts on this quote or what I just said? All right, well, let's move on to the last quote. So the last quote is actually from close to the beginning of the article. Baumol's cost disease, explains why barbers make more in San Francisco than in Cleveland and why services such as healthcare and education keep getting more expensive. And it provides a possible explanation for why rich countries like America are devoting more and more of their workforce to low productivity services, dragging down the economy-wide rate of productivity growth. So I'm going to say no. I don't really buy Baumol's cost disease as a strong effect for explaining any of these things. But we're getting to the end here. So let's go around and get people's final thoughts. So let's see. The order will be Martin, Derek, Elizabeth, David, Elliot, Joan, Steve, Bethany, Eddie.
So I guess my final thought is I'd have to think about how we tie this all back to UBI.
Okay.
I guess that's it. Yeah.
Derek, go ahead.
Well, I'll give it a shot. In the article, he writes that there's probably no way that we can retain our standard of living while getting costs to go down. And I think that it depends on how we look at it. It depends on how much of we think that the standard of living that we've achieved serves sources primarily from the production of goods versus the quantity of services that are available. So at the end of the article, there's this really stunning graph which shows the growth in service-related employment versus goods-related employment. And the goods-related employment has stayed exactly, it's lowered from 1965, from 20 million to about 19 million. And service-related employment shot up from 40 million to 120 million. So all of our new population growth is just channeled into the service industry. We have the same number of people making all goods. So I don't know if we ask, well, why were some people poor in 1965? Was it because there wasn't enough services, or was it because they didn't have money to buy goods? And it seems to me that, like, in that sense, a pretty affluent standard of living in 1965 could be instantly achieved today if you allowed more of these people to stop working unnecessary service jobs and just buy the same amount of goods that we have available.
Yeah, interesting thing about labor-intensive work is that you can kind of always create more of it. You can always create more services. If your goal is to keep everyone employed, then you probably are not going to be looking to higher productivity sectors, higher productivity jobs. So let's go to Elizabeth.
Sorry. Yeah, I don't feel like I have anything particular to add. I appreciated the conversation, especially sort of pressing on the are these things, the sort of high items on the graph, are those outliers for other reasons, and really digging into the different factors that play into this. So yeah, I appreciate that.
Okay, great. Let's go to David and then Elliot.
Oh, that's a really interesting conversation. I don't know if I buy the premise of the disease or not, and I certainly think that disease seems like a strange word to call it. There seems like there may be some truth to it, and it may be a lot of words just to say a high tide lifts all boats. But I wonder if there's other. It seems like there's a lot of other explanations that can get in there and pick it apart already. I'm thinking of like psychological effects that might affect the markets and stuff like that. So I haven't really come to any conclusions.
Okay, Elliot.
I think there's a big point of a psychology point in the disconnect theories in supply and demand, and why some this in this hand and that in the other hand, and like the whole psychology of things, why it's working the way it is working, and how it flattens out across the board, or make a grid of it or something like that, and why it happens to be the way it is. But it's a very interesting topic.
All right, thanks. Mom and then Steve. Mom?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, it was really interesting. I don't have any more to add. I agree with what I think it was David who said about digging into it more. I think it was a little bit too reductive in some ways to think of that as the only driving force behind the rising wages and costs. But yeah, it's always interesting. Thanks, Alice, and everybody. Yeah.
Yep. Steve, and then Bethany, and then Eddie.
I just read this book, Deaths of Despair.
Oh, great.
I don't know if you can see this by Angus Deaton and Ann Case, the economists. The letters are black on black. That's how much despair we're talking about. And it talks quite a bit about the country being destroyed by the high cost of healthcare. And I'm sure, being a Nobel Prize winning economist, they know about Baumol, but they never mention Baumol. They blame all the usual other suspects for the high cost of healthcare: politicians, big pharma, greedy doctors, lobbyists, etc., but not Baumol's effect.
Okay, well, I think I agree with them. We'll go Bethany and then Eddie.
Yeah, so I think I understand the argument. I think it rests, Baumar's argument, it rests on a couple of assumptions that you clearly don't agree with, and I don't know if I agree with, like that higher productivity is going to raise wages of the people in those jobs, and that there's going to be increased competition with other jobs across the economy as a result. But it was helpful to sort of understand what the assumptions were, and they might hold sometimes. I guess the bigger takeaway I have is, like, there's so many different things that affect the markets or that affect something like wages or cost. And so when in economics can you actually have like a model that's or an aspect where you can say this is kind of true, all else being equal, even, and it's relevant to think of it as true, even though other things are going to move things around as well. And to what degree can you not say that, because like there's just too many interactions between the different market forces. As I try to put together like my picture of how this field works, I'm still finding myself a little bit unsure about that model building aspect. Yeah, but it's a great discussion. Thanks.
Cool. Eddie, go ahead. I think you unmuted yourself and then muted yourself again.
Okay, so building off of the last point about government efficiency, I think that is an interesting story to tell because, again, real wages haven't gone up in 45 years. So if he's talking about, the last 45 years and government costs going up during this period, if you use the real wages as of workers as a denominator, you're still paying, ever more and more of society into the government versus what you're paying to workers. And to generalize that point, I think that economics is one of the very interesting humanistic sciences, like sociology and psychology. And you have to, but especially sociology. And one of the downfalls is that you don't have, double-blind, controlled placebo experiments in economics. It's just impossible. You'd have to have two Earths and be able to manipulate that. So one of the things that I am a big fan of is the idea of cliodynamics, which is the idea of that. Cliodynamics deals with history, and the idea is that, if you want to have a theory about how things works, but you can't, experiment with how things works, the best thing that you can do is build a model off of your theory. Say, you think that, government costs are rising or due to Baumol's cost effect. And if that's true, then you should model it. Say, based on what wages cost, 50 years ago versus now, this is how much government should cost, given just this effect, and then go back and then compare what actually happened to what your model says. And if you go back and forth long enough, I think you can get good results where you're kind of going from you're starting with a model, which is deductive, and then you're looking at the data and comparing to that and seeing, going back and forth from the facts to the theory to try to get the theory as accurate as possible. Yeah, that's my concluding thought.
Cool. Well, personally, I'm a little bit skeptical of the Clio Dynamics, Peter Turchin stuff, but that actually might be an interesting topic for a future Boston Basic Income discussion. I think as far as Baumol's cost disease goes, kind of like I said at the beginning, I think there's, we have better explanations for the stuff that he's saying. And Eddie, you brought up that, in the last 40 years, worker wages really haven't been rising with productivity and that kind of stuff. And it's funny because, Baumol came up with this in the 1960s. So that was before that started happening. So he was trying to explain, a situation. He was trying to explain the world that he saw, and he thought this was kind of a good explanation for it. And certainly there are people now, like the guy who wrote this article, who's saying like, oh, look at, the lower productivity, goods and services are getting more expensive, and the higher productivity goods and services are getting less expensive. But I don't think we need Baumol's cost disease to explain that. And I certainly don't think we need Baumol's cost disease to explain why healthcare, education, and housing are getting more expensive. I think, if we have a basic income, that allows us to stop employing workers unproductively as a way of giving them money. And I'd be interested to see what the believers in Baumol's cost disease would say once we're in a world with, basic income calibrated to the highest level the economy can handle, and we're, kind of we're increasing productivity, and we're decreasing the amount of labor and that kind of thing. Or we're increasing the economy's production even, and potentially even decreasing wages at the same time we increase incomes and all of that. I think, Baumol's cost disease would have a hard time holding water if we were living in that kind of world, which I hope we will be living in soon. So thanks for the discussion, guys. This was really great. Next week, we have basic income expert Carl Widerquist coming back. He's going to be giving a talk on private property and how private property systems, or the concept of private property only makes sense or only works effectively for the benefit of people if you have a basic income. And without the basic income, you start to see problems with private property that a lot of people complain about that are maybe not inherent to private property itself, but a consequence of the fact that we don't have basic income. So he's going to give an hour talk, and then we'll ask him questions. So that's next week. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Great talk.
Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.